and furthering and enabling security and political environments that can effectively attract investment and international business. We welcome Syria re-engaging with international financial institutions, including the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Indeed, the letter paid its first visit to Syria since 2009, earlier this month, and emphasized that the country will need substantial international support for its effort to rehabilitate the economy, meet urgent humanitarian needs, and rebuild essential institutions and infrastructure. Madam President, the Special Envoy and I will shortly return to Syria to continue direct engagement with the interim authorities and a broad cross-section of Syrian society. We will continue to support the interim authorities and the Syrian people towards a new and a better chapter in Syria's history and a fully inclusive transition in line with the principles of Security Council Resolution 2254, one that restores Syria's sovereignty and unity and meets the aspiration of the Syrian people. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Ms. Rushdie for her briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Joyce Msuya.
Thank you, Madam President. As Deputy Special Envoy, my colleague Najat Rushdie has just set out, the people of Syria continue to navigate a dizzying mixture of challenges and opportunities as they pursue a better future. Today, I want to offer another reminder of what is at stake and highlight 4 main points for this Council's attention. First, we must keep a strong focus on the scale of the humanitarian crisis in Syria, which remains one of the largest in the world. While the reduction in conflict and growing engagement with international partners are opening new prospects for investing in Syria's future, we must not forget that 3/4 of the population still need humanitarian relief right now. Security remains volatile in parts of the country, including the coast, the south, and the northeast, where attacks continue to affect civilians and humanitarian operations. Over 7 million people remain displaced, including many newly uprooted by recent violence. Over 1.1 million internally displaced people, along with more than 500,000 refugees, have returned in the past 6 months. But many of them will still rely on humanitarian aid, including early recovery support, as they work to rebuild their lives. Unexploded ordnance remains a deadly threat, killing at least 414 people and injuring close to 600 more since December. 1/3 of these victims are children. This threat is also a key concern for displaced people who want to return to their homes. Health systems remain overwhelmed, with fewer than 60% of hospitals and less than half of primary healthcare centers fully functional. As we enter the warmer months, the cholera outbreak risks getting worse due to population movements, disruptions to water systems, and drought. Syria, along with much of the region, is experiencing its worst dry spell in more than 3 decades. This will likely shrink agricultural output with up to 3/4 of its wheat crop, enough to feed 16 million people for a year, at risk of failure at a time when more than half of the population already faces food insecurity. Madam President, my second point, the UN and its partners continue to do what we can to provide critical assistance and make the most efficient use of the limited resources we have. We are now in the last stages of transitioning to a more efficient and unified humanitarian coordination model, one that harnesses the efforts of organizations working across the country under the leadership of the humanitarian coordinator in Damascus. These efforts were also supported through a joint mission between OCHA's Director of Operations and Advocacy and the World Health Organization's Director of Health Emergency Interventions in late May. This revised structure is now largely in place. The coordination mechanisms in Gaziantep and Amman, which have been so critical to our ability to provide assistance throughout Syria over the years, will be phased out by the end of the month. Through this transition, we have reached close to 2.5 million people with critical assistance each month, including food, water, and health, despite shrinking funding. This includes, for example, close to 2 million people reached each month with health interventions. This year, the World Health Organization has supported over 2.7 million causes of treatment and more than 430,000 medical procedures. The Syria Humanitarian Fund is supporting health, water, and sanitation services for 850,000 people at risk of cholera in Aleppo, Damascus, Al-Hasake, and Latakia. The fund has also launched a 60 million joint allocation with the Syria Cross-Border Humanitarian Fund to assist displaced populations, host communities, and returnees. UNICEF, WHO, and other partners are providing mobile health and nutrition services in underserved areas. In May, over 170,000 young children and pregnant and breastfeeding women were screened for malnutrition with a particular focus on the coastal areas. Thousands of explosive items have been discarded in clearance operations, improving people's safety as well as access for humanitarian actors. We continue to make use of the most cost-efficient routes available. This includes the route from Turkey, through which the UN has transported over 1,200 trucks of aid this year, more than 6 times as many as the same period last year. In May, assistance transported along this route benefited over 1.2 million people across much of Syria. The World Food Programme is sourcing more supplies locally, driven by changes in the exchange rate. Meanwhile, our teams are exploring how the recent announcements by the US, UK, EU, and others to ease sanctions can help us further streamline transactions and procurement and expand access to items like advanced medical equipment. However, and this is my third point, we need more funding to keep this work going, if not to expand it. Nearly halfway through the year, our humanitarian appeal has received only $260 million, just 14% of the requirements for this period. At a time when NGOs have new opportunities to expand their activities across Syria, many are instead forced to scale back. This continues to translate into reductions in critical activities. Across Syria, 280 health facilities, 16% of the total, have suspended or reduced capacity due to funding cuts affecting all 14 governorates. In northern Syria, 240 health facilities risk closing due to funding cuts, potentially affecting more than 4.2 million people. Some 24 safe spaces for women and girls have been shuttered, and an estimated 265,000 people will lose access to life-saving reproductive health services. Other sectors face equally stark challenges. This year, we have already narrowed our focus to target 8 million of the most vulnerable people in Syria, less than half of the total number in need. In light of the global funding context, we will continue to adjust our operations in line with the humanitarian reset laid out by the Emergency Relief Coordinator in March. But this will ultimately mean doing less with less. My final point, Madam President, is that we must translate this moment into concrete support for Syria's reconstruction and development. For our part, as humanitarians, we will continue to see through the shift to more efficient ways of working with simplified structures, growing partnerships with local actors, and a sharpened focus on the most critical life savings needs to help ensure the most vulnerable are not passed by. But the people of Syria want to move beyond dependence on aid and to rebuild their own livelihoods. As more families return home, demand for healthcare, education, water, and electricity will only grow. As Deputy Special Envoy Rochdi has stated, recent moves to ease sanction open new opportunities for investment in restoring critical services. Recent announcements of planned investments and the growing engagement by international financial institutions are encouraging. The UN has also proposed areas for possible development activities in support of the transition. But these opportunities need to be matched with concrete initiatives to rebuild Syria and restore basic services. We cannot assume that adequate funding will just resume. With diplomatic and economic ties being reestablished, international partners re-evaluating their footprints and postures in Syria, political processes coming into focus, and a continued reduction in conflict, we have a window of opportunity right now that may not last. We need to act decisively to help this transition deliver the better future the people of Syria desperately want. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Masuya for her briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Amne Kolani.
Thank you so much. السيدة الرئيسة السيدات والسادة
Madam President,
اسمي آمنة
ladies and
الخولاني
gentlemen,
وأنا
my name is
مدافعة عن
Amna
حقوق
Khulani, a
الإنسان
human rights
ناجية من
defender,
المعتقل والمديرة
survivor from
التنفيذية
detention,
لمنظمة
and
عدالة.
executive director of
قبل 6
Adalati.
سنوات
6
جلست
years
في
ago,
هذا
I
المجلس ذاته
sat in this very
أمام ممثلي
council
نظام الأسد
facing
النظام
representatives
الذي
of an
اعتقل
Assad
إخوتي
regime, the same
مجد
regime that
ومحمد
arrested my
وعبد
brothers
الستار
Majd Muhammad and Abdul
وأعدمهم في
Sattar and
مراكز الاحتجاز
executed them in detention
كما فعل مع
centers
مئات
as it
الآلاف
did
من
with
السوريين
hundreds of
والسوريات.
thousands of
في ذلك
Syrians,
الوقت
men and women.
ناشدت
At that
المجتمع
time, I
الدولي
pleaded with the international
لإنصاف
community
المعتقلين وذويهم
to deliver
ورفعت
justice to the
صوت شعب
detainees and their
يذبح في
families.
وضح
I gave
النهار
voice to a people being
واليوم
systematically
أعود إليكم
slaughtered in
بشعور
plain
مختلف
sight.
شعور
Today, I return
أسميته
with a different
الشعور
feeling,
السوري
one
مزيج
only a
من الحزن
Syrian would
والفرح
know, a blend of
من
grief
الألم
and joy,
والأمل
of pain
شعور
and hope.
اختبرته عند
A
زيارتي
feeling
الأولى لدمشق
that I sensed
بعد
when I first
تحريرها
returned to
حزنت على من
Damascus after
فقدناهم من
its
الأحبة
liberation.
وفرحت
I
لأن
found myself
تضحياتهم
in
لم
between
تذهب
mourning
سدى
those who
حالتي
lost and
كحال
finding solace in the
ملايين
thought
السوريين
that their sacrifices were not
ولأول
in
مرة
vain, just like millions of
أستطيع أن
Syrians.
أتكلم
For the
كناشطة
first time, I'm
حقوقية
able to speak
دون خوف
as
من
a
الاعتقال أو التعذيب
human
أو
rights
القتل في
defender
سوريا
without fear of arrest
سوريا
or
الجديدة
torture in
التي
Syria.
عدنا
A
لها
new
لخدمة
Syria
أهلنا
that
ونحن
we
بينهم
return to
نفتح
serve our
مقرات
people, this time
لمؤسسات
from
المجتمع
within,
المدني
creating
دون
spaces for
أن
civil
نتهم
society
بالخيانة
to
كما
engage
كان الحال
closely
لعقود
without fear of being branded
وهذا لم
traitors,
يكن
as was the case
ليتحقق
for decades.
لولا
None
التضحيات
of this would
الكبيرة
have been possible
التي
without the
قدمها الشعب
immense
السوري
sacrifices made
بكل
by the
أطيافه
Syrian people in
صار
all their
لدينا وطن
diversity. Today,
نخاف
we have
عليه
a
لا منه
homeland we fear
وطن
for, not
نحبه
from, a
ويحبنا
country that
هذه
loves us, that
لحظة
we love.
فخر
This is a
وأمل
moment of
ومسؤولية
pride, of hope, of
أصحاب السعادة
responsibility.
واجهت
Excellencies,
النساء السوريات عبر
for
عقود طويلة
decades, Syrian women
ظلما
have faced
اقتصاديا
legal,
واجتماعيا
economic, and
وقانونيا
social injustice.
وزادت الانتهاكات خلال الحرب من اعتقال وتعذيب
Challenges were
وقتل
far
وعنف
worse during
جنسي.
the war through detention,
ورغم هذه
torture, killing, and
التحديات
sexual
الهائلة
violence. Yet,
كانت
despite
النساء
such profound
السوريات في
challenges,
طليعة
Syrian
العمل
women
من أجل
were at
العدالة.
the forefront,
وثقنا
leading
الانتهاكات،
the fight for
قدمنا
justice. We
المساعدات،
documented violations,
وسعينا لبناء
provided
السلام.
aid, and tried
ويجب
to
أن
lay the
يكن في
foundations
قلب
for
المرحلة
peace. And they
الانتقالية
should also
وجزءا
be
محوريا
central to the
من مستقبل
transitional
سوريا.
phase and part and
منذ
parcel
التحرير
of Syria's
بدأت
future.
النساء
Since
بالمطالبة
liberation, women have
بدورهن
begun to
في
claim
إعادة بناء
their
سوريا.
role in
وإن
rebuilding
وجودهن
Syria.
اليوم
Their
في
presence
مواقع
today
متقدمة داخل
in
الدولة
senior
له خطوة
government
مهمة،
positions marks an
لكنها غير
important
كافية
progress.
أبدا.
However, it's
الفجوة
not
لا تزال
enough.
كبيرة بين
A
الواقع
significant
وما
gap
نطمح
remains
إليه.
between reality
نطالب
and
بمستوى
aspiration. We
مشاركة
call for a
يعكس
level of
تضحيات النساء
participation that
ودورهن
genuinely
في صنع
reflects
القرار على
women's
الصعيد المحلي
sacrifices and
والوطني.
their role in
قبل أشهر
decision-making locally and
بدأت مع مجموعة
nationally.
من
A few
النساء
months
من
ago,
مختلف المكونات
I
جولة في المدن السورية
traveled to Syria
إلى
with a
درعا،
diverse group of women.
حمص،
We
السلمية،
went to Dara,
السويداء،
Homs,
ودير مار
Salamiyya,
موسى،
Suwaida, and the
كنيسة
monastery of
الأباولو
Mar
وغيرها.
Musa, in addition to other
للتواصل مع
places.
المجتمعات
The objective was
السورية
to
المختلفة
connect with different
ومناقشة
communities in Syria
رؤيتنا
and discuss
لمستقبل سوريا
our
الحبيبة.
vision for our
وجدنا
beloved
سوريا مرهقة
country. We encountered
ومجتمعات
a nation
تمر
weary
بمرحلة
and
إعادة
communities
بناء
navigating a
نفسي
process of
واجتماعي
social and
فيها
psychological
تقاطع
recovery
بين
at
الخوف
a
والأمل،
delicate moment
بين
where hope
الإرادة
and fear,
والحذر.
determination and caution
ومعظم
ebb and
الناس
flow.
متفائلون رغم
Most
الألم
of the people are
والتحديات
optimistic despite
ويشعرون أن
pain and
القادم
challenge.
أفضل.
They feel
وهناك من
that
يشعر بالقلق
there are
من
better
المرحلة
days
المقبلة
coming, but some are
والتوتر
wary of what
الأمني
lies
الحاصل،
ahead. There
ولكن
is a
هذا
legitimate
قلق مشروع
concern
ويجب
that
التعامل
calls
معه
for
بشفافية
transparency
واحترام.
and respect.
كما لاحظنا
We
تباينا في
also
الآراء
observed the wide
حول
range of
المرحلة
views on the
الانتقالية وهو
transitional
أمر
period,
صحي
which is
جدا.
a healthy
ورغم
sign.
استمرار التوترات
Despite
الطائفية
persistent
وهي من
sectarian
أبشع
and ethnic
تركات النظام
tensions,
البائد،
some of the
فإن
hardest
السوريون
legacies of the former
يظهرون
regime,
إرادة
Syrians
حقيقية
demonstrate a
لتجاوز
genuine
الماضي
determination
المؤلم
to move
وشوقا
beyond a
عميقا
painful
للسلام
path
والاستقرار.
with a profound desire
اليوم
for peace and
تقع على
stability.
عاتق الدولة
Today,
السورية
the
الجديدة
new Syrian
مسؤولية
government
كبرى في
shoulders a
معالجة
huge
هذا
responsibility
الإرث
to
من
address
خلال
this
ضمان
legacy
مشاركة
by
الشعب
ensuring
السوري
that all
بكل
Syrians
مكوناته
from
في صياغة
every
المستقبل.
background to
نحن
actively
نؤمن
participate in shaping
أن سوريا
the future.
يجب
We
أن
believe
تبنى
that Syria must
بيد
be
رجالها
built by
ونسائها
its people,
على
men
أساس
and women
الديمقراطية،
alike, on the
المواطنة،
foundations of democracy,
المساواة،
citizenship,
احترام حقوق
equality,
الإنسان
and
دون
respect for human
تمييز.
rights without
ويجب أن تكون
discrimination.
التشاركية مبدأ أساسيا
Participation
في
should
كل
be
خطوة
the principal
من الحوارات
guide at every
من
stage,
الحوارات الوطنية
from national
إلى العملية
dialogue to the
السياسية
political
وصولا إلى
process,
جهود
up
العدالة
until
والمساعدة.
reaching justice and
السيدات
accountability
والسادة،
measures. Ladies and gentlemen,
العدالة الانتقالية في سوريا
transitional justice in
ليست
Syria
ترفا
is not a
سياسيا،
political luxury.
بل هي حاجة
Instead,
وضرورة
it is
وطنية
a national and
وأخلاقية
moral
لتحقيق
imperative
السلم الأهلي.
essential for achieving civil
وإن
peace.
الإسراع في البدء الفعلي
Accelerating the effective
بمسار
launch
العدالة
of the
لهو
justice
الضمان
process
الوحيد
is the
لسلام
only true
حقيقي
guarantee
ومستدام.
of genuine
فلا
and
سلام
sustainable peace.
بلا
There can be
عدالة.
no peace
No
without
justice,
justice.
no peace.
No justice, no peace.
لقد تم مؤخراً إنشاء الهيئات
Recently,
الهيئة الوطنية للعدالة
two national
الانتقالية
bodies have been established:
والهيئة
the National
الوطنية
Commission for
للمفقودين.
Transitional Justice
وفي
and the National
اجتماعات
Commission for the
مع
Missing.
الهيئتان في
In
دمشق
meetings with both
حضرتهما
bodies in
مع
Damascus, which
نشطاء
I attended
وناجيات
alongside
وأهالي
with
ضحايا.
activists,
شدد
survivors, and
الحضور
victims'
على
families,
استقلالية
participants
هذه
strongly
المؤسسات
emphasized the need for
وأهمية
independence of these
التشاور مع
bodies.
الناس
There was also broad
في
consensus
كل
on the
المدن
need for
السورية
consultation with communities
وضرورة
across all
الشفافية مع ذوي
Syrian
الضحايا
cities. There is a need for
والناجين
transparency with
وتضمين
victims,
رؤيتهم
survivors,
في محور
and
مسار
integrating their
العدالة
vision into the
الانتقالية.
core
كما
of the
أكد
transitional
الحضور
justice
على
process.
أهمية التعاون
Participants also
بين هذه
emphasized the need
الهيئات
for cooperation
والمؤسسات
between
الوطنية في
these
سوريا
bodies and
والآليات
other
الدولية مثل
international
المؤسسة المستقلة
mechanisms
المعنية
and national
للمفقودين
institutions, including the
والآلية الدولية
independent
المحايدة
institution on missing
والمستقلة
persons and
وغيرها
the IIM
لوضع خارطة
and
طريق
others to
واضحة
develop a
والبدء
clear
بالعمل
roadmap
لتكون
and
الجهود
initiate
المبذولة
implementation.
شاملة
Thus, the
ذات
efforts would
مصداقية
be inclusive,
متوافقة
credible,
مع
and
المعايير الدولية.
consistent with international
السيدة الرئيسة،
standards. Madam President,
سوريا اليوم تعيش في
Syria
مرحلة
today is
إعادة
undergoing
إعمار
a
شاملة
comprehensive
لا
process
تقتصر
of
على البنية
reconstruction,
التحتية
not only
بل
of its
تمتد إلى
infrastructure,
إعادة
but
البناء
also
النفسي
of
والمجتمعي.
the
رفع
society
العقوبات
and
لا
psychological
يعني أن الحاجة إلى الدعم
rebuilding.
الدولي قد
Lifting of
انتهت.
sanctions does not signal
بالعكس،
an end to the need for
فالنظام
international
البائد
support. Quite the contrary.
خلف
The
حطام
previous
دولة
regime
بلا
left behind
مؤسسات
a
حقيقية.
shattered state,
وسوريا بحاجة
bereft of functioning
إلى دعم
institutions.
دولي
Syria
مسؤول
requires
يحترم
responsible
استقلالها.
international assistance that
في
fully
زيارتي الأخيرة
respects its
للبلاد
independence.
بعد
During
الإعلان
my
عن رفع
recent
العقوبات
visit to
كان الناس مبتهجين
Syria,
جدا
Joyce
رغم
went through
علمهم
the streets
بأن
following the
النتائج
news of the lifting
قد
of sanctions,
تستغرق
even though they knew
أشهر لتظهر أو
that
أكثر
the
من ذلك.
effects of the lifting of the sanctions would take
ولذلك
time to
يمكن اليوم
materialize, months or more.
للمجتمع
For
الدولي
this reason, the
وبدعم
international
من هذا
community,
المجلس ومنذ
with the
الآن
support of this
أن
council,
يبدأ
must
في
act
تسريع جهود
now
التعافي
to
المبكر
accelerate early
عبر
recovery
دعم
efforts.
فني
This
ومالي
includes
لإزالة
financial and technical
الألغام
support for mine
ومخلفات الحرب
clearance, the
التي
removal of
تقتل
war
عشرات
debris, which
المدنيين
continue to kill dozens of civilians.
وتنظيف الأنقاض
We could also
وتحسين
start with the
الخدمات
restoration of
الأساسية
essential services
الصحة
such as health,
التعليم
education,
المياه
water,
الكهرباء
electricity,
النقل والمواصلات
transport,
وغيرها.
and telecommunication, among
نحن لا
others.
نطلب
We're
حلولا
not
جاهزة
seeking ready-made solutions.
بل نطلب
Rather,
نقل
we
خبرات
call for the
حقيقية
transfer of genuine
تساعد المؤسسات
expertise
السورية
to assist
الناشئة
Syria's
على
emerging
إدارة
institutions in
المرحلة
managing this
الانتقالية بكل
transitional
كفاءة.
phase effectively.
فبناء مؤسسات
Building
قوية
robust
هو الضمان
institutions
الوحيد
remains the sole
للاستقرار
guarantee
وعودة
of lasting
اللاجئين
stability and the
السوريين
return of
إلى
Syrian
بلادهم.
refugees to their homeland.
أصحاب السعادة،
Your Excellencies,
إلى الدول التي
to those
ساندت الشعب
countries that
السوري
have stood
خلال 14 عاماً
by the Syrian people
والتي
through
استقبلت
14
اللاجئين
years, those who
والتي
have
ساهمت
welcomed
في رفع
refugees and
العقوبات،
supported in lifting
شكراً
sanctions,
جزيلاً لكم.
I extend my sincere thanks and
شكراً جزيلاً
gratitude
لكم
to you.
لأنكم وقفتم في الجانب
Thank
الصحيح
you
من
for
التاريخ.
standing on the right side of
أما من
history.
وقف في الجانب الآخر
As to those who
بما
align
فيهم بعض
themselves
من
with
في
the
هذه
other side,
القاعة
including some present in this
فالأوان لم يفت بعد
chamber,
للوقوف
I will
معنا
tell you it is not
وتقديم
too
الدعم
late to
لشعب
join us
لا
now and
يعرف
to
المستحيل.
support
بناء على ما سبق
people who
أحث
refuse to accept
المجلس
defeat.
على ما يلي:
Accordingly, I
أولاً،
urge the Council to the following. First,
تشجيع ودعم الحكومة السورية
encourage and
لضمان
support the
المشاركة
Syrian
الكاملة
government to guarantee
المتكافئة
the full,
الآمنة
equal,
وذات المعنى
meaningful
للنساء
and safe
من جميع
participation of women
الخلفيات
from
في
all
صنع القرار
backgrounds in decision
وطنيا
making,
ومحليا
both nationally
بنسبة لا
and
تقل
locally,
عن
aiming for a
30%.
minimum representation of 30%.
ثانياً،
Second,
تشجيع ودعم ذوي الضحايا
promote and
والناجين
support
خصوصا النساء
victims and
في
survivors,
جميع جهود
particularly
العدالة
women, in all
الانتقالية
transitional
الرسمية
justice
وغير
initiatives,
الرسمية
be it formal or
بصفتهم
informal,
أصحاب الحق
recognizing them as rights
وجزءاً
holders
أساسياً
and
من
part and
عملية
parcel
السلام
of
والاستقرار.
the peace and
ثالثاً،
stabilization efforts.
تشجيع ودعم
Third,
الحكومة السورية
encourage and
في
support the
اتخاذ
Syrian
تدابير
government to
فعالة
implement
للبحث عن
effective
جميع
measures to locate all missing
المفقودين
persons
وإعادة رفاتهم دون تمييز،
and return their
والتعاون
remains
الفني
without
مع المؤسسات
discrimination.
الدولية ذات الصلة
There
لتبادل
should also
الخبرات
be
ووضع
technical
آليات
cooperation with
فعالة
relevant international
لذلك.
organizations to share
رابعاً،
expertise and establish
الترحيب
robust
برفع
mechanisms.
العقوبات
Fourth,
الأحادية
welcome the lifting
والمتعددة
of
الأطراف
unilateral and
التي كانت
multilateral
تفرض على
sanctions
نظام الأسد،
previously imposed on the
والدعوة
Assad
لمراجعة
regime,
التدابير
and call
المتخذة
for
من
a
قبل
thorough
مجلس
review
الأمن
of measures
بموجب
enacted
القرار
under Security Council
1267
Resolution
والتي قد تعيق
1267 that
التعافي
may
الاقتصادي
impede
العاجل
Syria's urgent
لسوريا.
economic recovery.
أصحاب السعادة،
Excellencies,
رغم الجراح
though
تقف سوريا اليوم
scarred,
حرة ومستقلة.
Syria stands today
لدينا
free and
الإرادة
independent.
ولدينا القدرة على بناء
We
مستقبلنا.
possess the will and the
ما
capacity
نحتاجه
to shape
اليوم
our own
ليس
future.
الدعم
What
فقط
we need today
بل
is not
شراكة
mere
حقيقية
support, but a genuine
تقدر
partnership
تضحياتنا
that honors our
وتحترم
sacrifices
العملية
and
السياسية
respect
القائمة
the
بقيادة سوريا.
Syrian-led political
وبينما نواجه
transition. As
التحديات
we
الصعبة في
confront
المرحلة
such
الانتقالية
complex challenges in
فإننا
this transitional
نتمسك
phase,
بالأمل
we hold
ونعمل
fast to
من
hope
أجل وطن
and work
يتسع
towards a
للجميع
homeland that
وندعو العالم
embraces
أن
everyone.
يقف
We call
معنا
upon the world to
لا من
stand with
أجلنا
us,
فقط
not
بل من
only
أجل
for
القيم
Syria,
الإنسانية
but
التي
in
تجمعنا.
affirmation of the fundamental
شكرا لكم.
values that bind us
عاشت
together.
سوريا حرة
Thank you.
وعاش
Long live
شعبها.
a free Syria and its proud people. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Kulani for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. And thank you to my colleague, Deputy Special Envoy Najat Roshdi. Nice to see you. And Assistant Secretary General Joyce Msuya. Thank you for your briefings. And I'd also like to thank Ms. Amne Kulani for your longtime bravery and for your compelling remarks today. Thank you for supporting human rights for all Syrians, especially the most vulnerable. And I'd also like to welcome the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic. Colleagues, the United States has started a new era in its relationship with Syria. Following President Trump's historic meeting with President Ashara, the United States is working towards ceasing U.S. sanctions on Syria. On May 23rd, Secretary of State Rubio waived sanctions under the Caesar Syria Civilian Protection Act for 180 days, and the U.S. Department of the Treasury issued General License 25, authorizing a broad range of transactions and investments in Syria. We have already begun to see the impact of these actions, most notably in the signing of a $7 billion deal under which the United States, Qatari, and Turkish firms would invest in Syria's power sector. As Ambassador Tom Barak stated after raising the U.S. flag in Damascus, this is just the beginning of the positive impact that the easing of sanctions will have on reconstruction and investment in Syria. The cessation of U.S. sanctions against Syria will give the country a chance to succeed. We encourage other member states to provide similar sanctions relief and to support recovery and reconstruction. President, as we have said, the Syrian government's actions so far on critical files, like the search for missing persons and the destruction of chemical weapons, have given us hope for what Syria can achieve and set expectations for what must come next. First, the government should begin discussions with Israel on a non-aggression agreement and subsequently begin border dispute resolution discussions. Second, the government should, in short order, present its plan and intentions with regard to the foreign fighters on Syrian soil. Third, the government should take necessary steps to ban and deport Palestinian terror groups. Fourth, the government must work with the United States in its continuing de- or counter-ISIS operations. Fifth, the government must provide a plan for how it will assume responsibility for ISIS detention centers in northeast Syria. Countries of origin must also play their part to expeditiously repatriate their nationals from northeast Syria, including those detained in Syrian Democratic Forces facilities and those displaced in Al-Hol and Roj displaced persons camps. Finally, we are encouraged by Syria's cooperation with both the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons and the International Atomic Energy Agency, and we look forward to further progress. Colleagues, on the UN's forthcoming strategic assessment for its presence in Syria, this Council should carefully consider the Secretary General's report and work together to determine the appropriate role and presence of the UN in Syria going forward. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Madam President, we are grateful to Najat Roshdi and Joyce Msuya, as well as Amne Kulani, for their briefings. Madam President, Israel's military misadventures continue to exacerbate the situation in the entire Middle East. The new wave of tensions in the context of the Iran-Israeli confrontation generate risks not just for Syria, but also its citizens who have for many years borne the burden of the protracted humanitarian and economic crisis. Pulling this country into the quagmire of regional conflict risks escalation of centrifugal trends in the Syrian Arab Republic, which needs to be avoided at all costs. What is inadmissible also is the use of Syrian airspace or territory by third countries. Since the last meeting of the Security Council on Syria, all of the challenges which the country continues to face remain relevant. There has been a significant increase in the risks of resumption of large-scale terrorist activity, including by ISIL affiliate groups. We expect that Damascus will adopt robust counterterrorism measures and will resolve also the situation with foreign terrorist fighters. There's a need for following the reform of the Syrian security forces, the army and the police of the country to be staffed exclusively with professional staff with untainted track records. This will determine not just trust of the local population vis-a-vis the country, but also will shape the international image of Syria. In this connection, we welcome the release in recent months of hundreds of former army officers owing to the absence of legal justification for their ongoing detention. Such actions on the part of Damascus reflect a genuine focus on intra-Syrian reconciliation and reflect the intention to place the national interests of Syria above the interests of certain groups. We believe that by leveraging the capability and the capacity of hundreds of thousands of fighters who took the oath since before December 2024 will benefit the Syrian state and will help to avoid the tragic errors when many officers of the Saddam period were sidelined and then went on to raise the black flag of ISIL. The matter of Israeli violations of Syrian sovereignty and territorial integrity remains on the agenda. We call upon Israel to immediately revert back to stringent compliance with the 1974 disengagement of forces agreement and to withdraw from the buffer zone and the adjacent territories and to cease its shelling at Syria. Israeli actions can hardly be justified with claims about eliminating security threats from Syria, given the fact that Damascus has been continuously broadcasting its intention to peacefully coexist with all of its neighbors, barring none. We believe that any emerging issues can and must be resolved through dialogue. Madam President, there are persistent tensions in the south of the country. At the same time, we note the implementation of the provisional agreement between Damascus and the Druze to provide for security of local law enforcement bodies. Despite sporadic outbreaks of violence in the northeast, the agreement between the central authorities and the Trans-Euphrates continues to be implemented. The situation is exceedingly volatile in Latakia and Tartus provinces, where the levels of instability and security threats remain high. Recent tragic events, as a result of which civilians suffered en masse, these were primarily Alawites. This starkly attests to that. Thousands of families were forced to flee their homes. Some of these families have found temporary refuge in Lebanon, others at the Russian Khmeimim airbase, and still others in other Syrian regions. We look forward to the results of the national investigation of the events which took place on the Western Coast, holding all perpetrators accountable, irrespective of their status and affiliation, will demonstrate in fact the focus of the Syrian authorities and their commitment to rule of law. On the whole, hundreds of thousands of Syrians in neighboring regions remain acutely in need of humanitarian assistance. Once again, we call upon OCHA to pay heightened attention to the situation in Latakia and Tartus. We believe that the new UN humanitarian architecture in Syria needs to take into account the specificities of developments in these regions, and there needs to be provision of the necessary resources for prompt response to crises. Madam President, the data that has been shared today clearly shows that the humanitarian situation in Syria remains exceedingly dire, and it is far from having been resolved. This is exacerbated both by the consequences of the prolonged armed conflict and by the profound socioeconomic crisis, which is being fueled by the practice of the imposition of unilateral sanctions. We view the most recent messages about the partial potential lifting or easing of this illegitimate restrictive measures by the US, EU, and UK as a step in the right direction. At the same time, we wish to stress the following. These decisions should have taken much earlier for the Syrian people to have been able to exercise their legitimate right to development. Yet another blow to the residents of the country emanates from extreme weather events. According to United Nations assessment, Syria is experiencing its worst drought in decades. Up to 75% of the wheat harvest is under threat. Amid the woeful underfinancing for humanitarian operations, it will be exceedingly difficult for the international community to offset such losses if the wheat harvest in the country is not forthcoming. Moreover, the onset of the summer heat generates risks of communicable diseases spreading. UN agencies need to be ready to tackle these challenges and need to be able to adopt preventive and anticipatory measures for risk reduction. As far as we understand, OCHA has the relevant capabilities and it can leverage to that end various financial instruments, including the Central Emergency Relief Fund of the United Nations. There's another persistent serious threat. I refer to that of mine contamination. Mine contamination poses a direct threat to the lives of civilians, impedes humanitarian operations, and complicates the safe return of forcibly dispersed persons. We note with alarm that since December of last year, 400 people have already been victimized by unexploded ordnance. 1/3 of these people are children. The Syrian government and specialized international agencies need to redouble and step up efforts for mine clearance and awareness raising. We highly value the activities of UN humanitarian structures in Syria who are focused on saving people's lives. We believe that under present-day conditions, what is particularly important is food support programs, as well as efforts to rebuild the healthcare and water sectors. At the same time, we are very much concerned by the level of financing for the UN humanitarian appeal of the $2 billion requested from January to June 2025. Only approximately 13% has been received. The lack of resources is already generating grave consequences. There's a need right now to consolidate the efforts of donors in the international community. We cannot allow millions of Syrian people to be left without support at such a critical juncture. Madam President, we advocate a political process with the involvement of all ethno-religious groups and minorities in Syria with support from the UN and in accordance with the key provisions of Security Council Resolution 2254. We view this process as a linchpin for the restoration of Syrian sovereignty and territorial integrity. As the next steps along this path, we look forward to the formation of a provisional government and the crafting by the Constitutional Committee of a draft basic law. We reaffirm our support for the efforts of the UN Special Envoy, Geir Peterson. We look forward to the inclusive nature of the ongoing international support for intra-Syrian dialogue. Syria and its resilient people have tread their path, surmounting onerous travails with dignity, and despite it all, they preserve their faith in the best and focus on constructive cooperation with the international community. They deserve our concerted support. For our part, we intend to establish fruitful cooperation with Syria and intend to deliver its people and government with the necessary support to surmount the difficulties of the transitional period. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Madam President. And let me also thank Deputy Special Envoy Rushdie and Assistant Secretary General Masuria for their comprehensive briefings. Ms. Rolani, thank you for your powerful testimony and your description of the mixed feelings of grief and hope that many Syrian people have. Denmark is proud to have stood with the Syrian people throughout these difficult years. Madam President, allow me to make 3 points. First, on the security situation. There can be no meaningful recovery in Syria without genuine safety and protection for all Syrians. Protection of civilians is a cornerstone of international humanitarian law. While we acknowledge the Syrian transitional government's efforts to create a legitimate and united national army, more must be done towards securing the protection of all civilians. Reports of abductions of women, sporadic killings of civilians, and systematic attacks on communities need to be swiftly and credibly addressed. We also worried about the continued threat posed by terrorism in Syria. We strongly condemn attacks by Daesh in Aleppo and other parts of Syria, and we welcome the transitional government's emphasis on combating terrorism. Second, on the humanitarian and economic situation, Denmark is pleased with the European Union's decision to lift sanctions on Syria. This decision is a strong signal of the EU's commitment to support Syria's transition and economic recovery. The newly concluded electricity and power agreements is another step towards progress. It is now essential that these initial gains are continuously built upon and ultimately lead towards a broader, long-term positive economic impact and development for the Syrian people. Funding shortfalls are critical, and millions of Syrians continue to face food and water insecurity. Water scarcity, in particular, remains a serious concern. Denmark has and will continue to work to ensure access to water, including through our project with the ICRC on securing the continued supply of drinking water to more than 12 million people in urban centers across Syria. Third, Madam President, on the political process. We welcome yesterday's announcement by the transitional government on the establishment of the Supreme Committee for the Elections to the People's Assembly. We reiterate the call for an inclusive, transparent, and open process, as well as for the full, equal, and meaningful participation of representation of women. We take note of the establishment of the Transitional Justice and Missing Persons Commissions. These are important first steps towards a comprehensive and inclusive transitional justice process that represents all the victims. It is important to focus on atrocities committed by all actors across Syria. We reiterate our strong support for Special Envoy Peterson, his team, and all the UN staff working to assist Syria in this critical stage. We repeat the need for a political transition in line with Resolution 2254, a transition which must be led and owned by the Syrian people. Madam President, on the regional level, the situation looks even more challenging now than it did just 1 week ago. We welcome the transitional government's regional engagement, including constructive dialogue between Syria and its neighbors. We reiterate our support for Syria's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity, and call on all parties to adhere to the 1974 agreement. We also welcome both Syria's and Israel's calls for an extension of the UNDOF mandate later this month. Denmark stands ready to work with Syria, with this council, and with the broader international community in support of a peaceful and inclusive transition. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for her statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me also begin by thanking Deputy Special Envoy Najat Rushdie and ASG Joyce Masuya for their briefings. And we also thank Madame Kulani